the Baseball Hall of Fame voting took place and nobody got in. That isn't a surprise. It is what was expected. The three names that will be spoken of the most coming out of it are Curt Schilling, Barry Bonds, and Roger Clemens. I say them in that order because that is the order in which they received votes. Schilling actually got by far the closest. He was over 70%. You need to get 75% of the vote to get in. Schilling, I'm doing this from memory now. I had the notes in front of me, and I moved them away. My apologies, but he was like 16 votes short or something like that. He was very close. Bonds and Clemens further down the line. All three of them are in there. This was their 9th year of eligibility. You only get 10 years on the writers' ballots, and then eventually, if you were going to get in, you would have to be voted in by the Veterans Committee. So they have one more year each on the ballot. And one thing that I think is worth noting about next year, the symmetry of this, is that next year will be the last year on the ballot for Barry Bonds and Roger Clemens, and it will be the first year on the ballot for Alex Rodriguez. And I mention those because those are the three players of this era who have been most directly connected to performance-enhancing drugs, who are no doubt about it Hall of Famers. I mean, like, there's nothing to talk about. Not that they're the only ones, because there are others. I mean, if Sammy Sosa had put up his numbers without any questions about them, he would also obviously have been a first-ballot Hall of Famer. But A-Rod is one on the very, very short list of the greatest players that ever lived. Ever lived. They're not even close. This guy's a shortstop who hit 600 and something. What did he wind up with? How many homers did he wind up hitting? I mean, he was a brilliant shortstop, a great shortstop who voluntarily moved to third base to try and win games in New York, even though, candidly, he was a better shortstop than Jeter was, but that's a whole other discussion. And he wound up, how many home runs did he wind up hitting? He hit almost 700 home runs. So someone yell it out to me. It's worth saying that 696. He hit almost 700 home runs, and he was an infielder. So, I mean, what are we talking about here? If he's not going to get in, then nobody is. And the same is true of Clemens, who won 7 Cy Youngs. No one has ever won more than 5. And of Bonds, who won 7 MVPs. No one else ever won more than 3. So the question is, are those guys ever going to get in? Are there any writers who are in their minds are thinking, my punishment, which is a terrible way to approach this, but maybe it's the way they're viewing it, my punishment of them will be I will wait till their final year of eligibility and then I'll vote them in? Or will they just not get in? Hembo, who has worked with me forever and is my number one confidant when it comes to all matters baseball, tells me they're not getting in. And so A-Rod, in his first year next year, who knows? I don't know what's going to happen. So those were the great names from the steroid piece of this. And I talked at great length about that yesterday. I've put my cards on the table. My belief is those guys should be in the Hall of Fame. That is a change of my original perspective. The original perspective I had on this, and I wrote it in my first book, which I think I probably wrote that part of it in about 2001 or 2. I wrote that those guys don't belong in the Hall of Fame and that if you would cheat at the game, you can't say that you love it. And that was my perspective then. And as I told you yesterday, my mind changed. And the reason it changed is because my understanding of the circumstances changed. I thought that something like 5% of Major League Baseball players are using performance-enhancing drugs, and thus they should absolutely be separated from everybody else. But what I came to realize over the course of those years and investigations and Jose Canseco's book and congressional hearings and everything else that happened was that it was so prominent in the sport, it was so prevalent in the sport, that there's no reasonable way to determine who was and who wasn't. And you can't ignore an entire era of baseball when it comes to the Hall of Fame. So put the best players in and let history tell the story. So I would absolutely put in Clemens. I would absolutely put in Bonds. I would absolutely put in A-Rod, and there'd be nothing to talk about. Or you could talk about it however you want. But there'd be no discussion in my mind of whether or not to vote for them. I don't have a vote, so it doesn't really matter what I think. The other one was Schilling, and what I would say is I'm sure you've seen that what Curt Schilling did was after he didn't get in yesterday, he wrote a lengthy post on Facebook asking not to be on next year's ballot. He is not in the Hall of Fame. He's one of the great postseason pitchers of all time. You don't need me to tell you what Schilling was. Schilling was as good a big game pitcher as I've ever seen. He wasn't anywhere near the best pitcher I've ever seen. But in my lifetime of watching the sport, in a big game, if my life depended on the outcome, I would hand him the ball about as quickly as I would anyone I've ever watched. And that alone, I think, gets you in. And then you add in his strikeout numbers and everything else. To me, he's absolutely a Hall of Famer.
Thank you for watching ESPN on YouTube. For live streaming sports and premium content, subscribe to ESPN+.